Hello, my name's Hugh Morris and I'm Director of the RSCM. The Royal School of Church Music is an independent charity whose mission is to nurture and support effective music in worship. We do this by supporting church music and musicians at all ages and stages. The challenges of the last COVID-dominated year have made it necessary for us to rethink, time and again, what we can best be doing to keep the flame of church music burning brightly, and we will not give up in this task. We are not fixated on a glorious past, though we build with pride on our 94 years of work so far. We're more concerned with the education work of now and into the future. We have lots of exciting new plans coming to fruition. You can play a part. You might want to sign up to attend one of our webinars, events or courses. Or you might want to be involved as a volunteer with our newly relaunching Area Teams network. To the surprise of many, the RSCM does not receive funding from either the church or the state, and we're grateful for the support of all of those who enable us to carry out our work. You might consider becoming a financial supporter yourself, perhaps as a friend of the RSCM. Whatever it is, we hope you will want to share with us on our journey into the future. We value the chance to connect with you and warmly encourage you to be in touch. Wherever you are, and whatever your own circumstance, we hope you will see that the RSCM is there alongside you. Thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon, and a very warm welcome to you to the last in this series of the RSCM Friday Lockdown Lunchtime Lectures. My name is Tim Ruffer, and I'm the RSCM's Head of Publishing, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome Geoffrey Webber to talk to us about women composers and the Church of England. Geoffrey is General Editor of the Church Music Society, an organist and choir director, and has worked at both Oxford and Cambridge universities. Geoffrey will talk for about 45 minutes, then we'll answer any questions you may have. So please do use the YouTube chat feed to tell us where you are joining from and to ask questions throughout the lecture. If you're watching on Facebook, you can use the comments in the same way. You can put your questions as the lecture goes along, so don't feel you have to wait until the end. At the end of the lecture, I'll be giving out this week's code for any non-RSCM members who want to take advantage of our offer to become an individual member of the RSCM for a year at a 10% discount. This code will only last until 5 p.m. next Thursday. And finally, before we begin, we are pleased to be able to make these lectures free to join. But if you enjoy it, do please consider making a donation in appreciation. We are a charity and rely on the generous support of individuals like you to support church music and musicians. So, a very warm welcome, Geoffrey, and thank you for joining us. I think you were due to give this lecture at the beginning of the year, but were laid low by the coronavirus. I hope you're all better now and raring to go.
Indeed, I am. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, in that case, I shall leave you to it and see you on the other side.
Thank you, Tim. On the 7th of May, 1883, the Musical Association in London held a talk followed by discussion, not on YouTube, on the subject of women composers. The talk began as follows. I offer no apology for introducing this subject to the Musical Association. It possesses sufficient interest to command attention that I think it has not yet received. I do not pretend that my treatment of the subject will be at all adequate to its importance, nor do I come forward to advocate the cause of woman in musical art. She is, in the present day, quite capable of taking care of herself. It is only necessary to present a fair view of her position, to clear away misconception and prejudice, and it will be seen that the subject is by no means speculative, but very tangible and real. and its discussion will, I trust, be both interesting and profitable. The brave author was Stephen Stratton, born in London and a chorister in Ealing, who spent most of his life as an organist and music critic in Birmingham. I say brave because his audience was far from receptive to this mode of inquiry. I will spare you the details, but suffice to say that when the chairman offered his vote of thanks at the end, he chose to dwell on the comparison between the shape of the violin and, you've guessed it, the female form. Stratton's greatest contribution to music writing was his British musical biography, published in 1897, co-authored with James Brown. And his interest in compiling such information was also evident in his talk for the Musical Association. The published record, or proceedings of the event, contains an impressive list of women composers of all ages, a kind of prototype for the current Donne Women in Music online list, which I'm told has just hit 6,000 names. Here's a fragment. Stratton introduced it as follows. The following list of women who have appeared as composers does not pretend to anything like completeness, although the information has been drawn from many sources. It is compiled rather as evidence that women have been engaged in composition for a longer period of time and in more branches of the art than is generally supposed. Now, Stratton's list is not only instructive to us because it reminds us that the recent surge of interest in music by women composers is not an entirely new phenomenon, but also, for the purposes of this talk, because of what it tells us about the position of women composers in relation to sacred music, or more specifically, music composed for the church. Have you spotted any British composers yet? There are at least 3 here, I think, or arguably 2.5 if you consider the case of Victoria and Albert's daughter, Princess Beatrice. Of the first 50 names in Stratton's list, only 5 are British. You will see on the slide how music for piano or the solo voice predominate, and this is the case throughout the list. Women composers for the church? Well, Abbess Hildegard is there, and later nuns such as Isabella Leonarda, whose entry reads Mass, motets, vespers, etc. But no British woman is mentioned in relation to church music. If we come forward in time to the present and consider the contents of the pioneering issues of sacred music by women composers issued by Multitude of Voices, we encounter a similar pattern, with the historical names being mostly foreign. The name that stands out is, of course, the last one, Emma Mandela. The director and series editor, Louise Stewart, very wisely chose to call the collection Sacred Music by Women Composers and not Church Music by Women Composers. The piece by Mandela included in the collection is called The Desert and is an SATB arrangement by Olivia Sparkhall of a song or carol for voice and piano first published by Novello in 1892, not a piece of church music, therefore. There is indeed an enormous corpus of songs that are settings of sacred texts by women composers of the 19th and 20th centuries. One might highlight the case of Frances Allitson, that's her composing pseudonym, whose large output of songs contains several with sacred texts. One of her most popular songs was The Lord is My Light. See the title page here on the right. At the top you see it was associated with the famous tenor John McCormack, and in small type you may see it says organ ad lib. Here's the start of the song and also the organ part on the right. The PDF on IMSLP is unfortunately cut off on the right-hand side. But remarkably, we have a recording of John McCormack singing the work in 1917 to an orchestral arrangement. Here it is.
Lord is the strength of my life. The Lord
And yes, he does go even higher at the recap of this great tune. The piece was arranged for many different forces over the next half century or so. Busi even published a German texted version in 1904, and in 1955 an SATB unaccompanied version was published. Rather like Sparkhall's arrangement of Mandela's song, we see an intention of making a sacred song into something more churchy, with the organ part and then much later the choral version. But the original song is not, of course, a piece of church music. But before we look for some examples of music by women composers for the Church of England, we must consider more widely the issue of the place of women musicians generally in that church and how that compares with the activities of women musicians in society as a whole. It is clear that women composers from the 18th century onwards have struggled to have their voices heard, but also that when they have been heard, it has been in the two areas of music making with which women have traditionally been associated: piano and solo singing, both of which have always been able to flourish in domestic circumstances. Both activities received an enormous boost when the Royal Academy of Music was founded in 1822, offering for the first time professional training in music to women as well as men. Stratton mentioned the importance of this step for women composers in his 1883 talk, quote, "Certainly we had few English women composers before its establishment," end quote. In fact, women were admitted in the early years only as students of voice, piano or harp. But their wider success is evident in the appointment as early as 1844 of an 18-year-old woman, Kate Loder, as its first female professor of harmony. However, within the Church of England, all the musicians in the principal ecclesiastical establishments were male, and the essential grounding in music given to generations of children in the cathedrals and royal establishments of the nation was only available, of course, to boys. This, of course, contrasts greatly with music within the non-conformist branches of the Church, which have never sought to encourage all-male choirs, and indeed within the Roman Catholic Church. The musical accomplishments of generations of nuns over the centuries is now widely recognized, and in the UK, the cultivation during the 20th century of female voices within certain London churches, such as the Brompton Oratory and Farm Street Church, has been exceptional. But in the Church of England, the maintenance of the all-male choir has long been seen as sacrosanct. And I use this word with care, for those who have argued for its maintenance have often sought to justify their views on religious grounds. Sir Sidney Nicholson, founder of the RSCM, took the view of many others before him that the sound of the Boyd treble had a kind of disembodied quality that made it the perfect fit for the choral services of the Church of England. He also spoke to the Musical Association, this time in 1944. Here are his main opening remarks, where he emphasizes the importance of the tradition to the musical life of the nation. Nicholson's main theological objection to women singing in church might seem to us now as more worthy than the other main angle of attack, that the surplice was simply not a garment that a woman could wear. The debate played out in the pages of the Musical Times in 1889 and blamed on the activities of a church in Melbourne, Australia. This reminds me of the newspaper report of the Israeli-conducted Daria Atlas's appearance with the Royal Liverpool Philharmonic in 1965. The caption says it all. Nicholson's disembodied voice argument can, of course, be used in favour of girls rather than women taking part in Church of England services, but this issue is not the topic of my talk. My point here is simply that women have been excluded as practitioners of choral music at the highest level in the Church of England, more than in any other mainstream church. It is scarcely surprising, therefore, that in the past, so few of them have chosen to write music for it. My cat is joining in at this point. Sorry about that. Nicholson's disembodied voice argument, sorry, I lost my place. Yes, set against this negative point It is also important to recognise that women have been extremely active in various ways within the musical activities of the Church of England, certainly since the middle of the 18th century, in addition to the traditional involvement of girl and women singers at many parish churches, of course. And these roles have taken many forms. Consider Maria Hackett. This article by David Gedge explains the importance of her work in looking after the welfare of choristers, mostly at St Paul's Cathedral, but eventually in a much wider sphere of influence. S.S. Wesley remembered how when he was a chorister at the Chapel Royal, Hackett used to bring along tasty buns to help counter the effects of the boys being whipped by the almoner. Or Sarah Glover. In charge of the music at St Lawrence's Church, Norwich in the early 19th century, she developed her highly influential Norwich sol-fa notation as part of her quest to improve the singing of psalms. Tunes for psalms and hymns were indeed an area in which women could find themselves involved, and here as composers too. On the website of the Church Music Society, you will find an article by me that explores the work of two early 19th century women in this area, Jane Clark and Theophania Cecil. Here are the title and dedication pages of Clark's Select Portion of Psalms and Hymns. The Oxford Chapel referred to on the left is the London church now known as St Peter's in De Vere Street, just off Oxford Street. You can see Jane Clark's name at the foot of the dedication page on the right. And here's the title page of Cecil's volume, alongside an image of the chapel where she worked, now destroyed. Clark's work appears to have been as the musical editor of her volume, but inside Cecil's publication are some original hymn tunes by her, together with some symphonies or organ interludes. In fact, hymn or psalm tunes by women composers written for use within the Church of England can be traced back at least to the middle of the 18th century. And amongst further 19th century contributions, one should mention in particular the Mounsey sisters, Anne and Elizabeth, who jointly published Sacred Harmony in 1860. The sisters had both played a crucial role in the commissioning and first performance of Mendelssohn's Hear My Prayer, at which Anne played the organ, in the context of a concert, not a service. Anne married William Bartholomew, the librettist of both Hear My Prayer and the oratorio Elijah. Sacred Harmony is in fact more than just a collection of tunes for psalms and hymns, as it contains various extra items specifically for liturgical use. It contains several composed by the sisters themselves, including this chant by Elizabeth Mounsey, and two Kyrie settings, a gospel acclamation and a dismission by Anne, the last of which one might wish to describe as a kind of short anthem, the start of which is shown here. Another similar publication from the sisters appeared a few years later, the Hymns of Prayer and Praise, with chants, kyries, etc., in 1868. And to show that such activities were not purely confined to London, this publication of music by Margaret Lampon from 1851 was prepared for a church in Cornwall. Both Mounsey sisters worked as organists at major London churches, following in a tradition of professional women organists in the capital established around the middle of the 18th century. This short fragment from a list of long-serving organists given in the Musical Times in 1928 includes three women organists: Mary Allen at St Andrew Undershaft, Anne Mounsey, who just mentioned, and Annie Barton, who served for 54 years. Research by Deborah Orr into the Royal Society of Female Musicians that was founded in 1839 has highlighted a list of professional musicians in London in 1855. This has a total of 472 names, and 215, that's 46%, are women, mostly singers or pianists, just 25 organists, and 10 listed as harmony, meaning composers. In addition to professional church organists, there were celebrity concert organists too, most notably Elizabeth Sterling, whose career has been written about in a recent book by Judith Barger. This is not to say that women organists were always accepted easily. Public debate included concerns for how they could possibly see the pedals through their skirts, a fact that for some merely proved their exceptional proficiency. And some posts were specifically advertised as only being available to men. But since their numbers in comparison to male organists remained low, it is scarcely surprising that their number did not happen to contain many who were also composers. A woman composer in the 19th century would find much more success, as we have seen, sticking to songs and piano music. A few of them, however, did compose large-scale sacred works, such as oratorios or orchestral masses. And so again, were writing music that was religious, but not liturgical, and which would be performed by choral societies that contain women. Anne Mounsey, for example, composed the oratorio The Nativity in 1853 and Supplication and Thanksgiving, the sacred cantata, in 1864. One could also point to a fair amount of Christmas music, which often receives non-liturgical performances, and music associated with traditional female roles, such as music for children's choirs or specific occasions, such as flower festivals. Coming forward again briefly to more modern times, concerning the several collections of contemporary music issued by the RSCM, highlighted by Martin Thomas in his book English Cathedral Music and Liturgy in the 20th Century, the following statistics might be noted. Here too, in these publications, I should stress dating from before 1992, the presence of women only appears in relation to upper voice music. Many women composers have of course produced much material for children's choirs and for Christmas. And to combine the two, I might highlight the strikingly imaginative Make Ye Merry for sopranos, altos and children's choir, composed by Thea Musgrave and published under the title School Music in 1961. So, if we've been teased by a few hymn tunes and miscellaneous liturgical items, and music readily associated with female roles, what do we find if we search for anthems or service music composed by women composers for the Church of England? We should begin with this. A piece of music recently published by the Church Music Society, which has escaped notice hitherto, as it survives only in a collection of music published in 1785 that was compiled for the Asylum for Female Orphans in Lambeth, South London, a setting of Whilst Shepherds Watched by Jane Savage. Here's the opening of the work performed last Christmas by the Ely Cathedral Girls' Choir.
Yeah.
I've enlarged the image on the cover so as to make one thing particularly obvious. The asylum, like a similar institution further east along the south bank, the Magdalen Hospital for Reformed Prostitutes, was principally a female environment. Our investigation thus begins, perhaps unsurprisingly, with church music in a context that was associated with female roles. These institutions were founded directly in imitation of similar charity foundations in Italy and France, and the music of their chapels was highly praised. As well as the one church piece by Jane Savage, one of the most prominent English women composers of the century, Mary Barthellemon, formerly Polly Young, wrote several pieces for both the asylum and the Magdalen Hospital, published in 1795. Here's the title page where you can see those institutions mentioned, and the start of the third anthem. Although such extended and often highly elaborate anthems by men and women composers written for such charity institutions were composed for girls to sing rather than boys, this music has every right, of course, to be considered as church music, since their chapels were part of the established church. Sidney Nicholson's appeal to the ancient history of boys' choirs in the church made no mention of such activities. And so, from the late 18th century onwards, a trickle of pieces by women composers begins to appear, some of which have survived, some of which have been lost. The exceptions that prove the rule that women composers have historically played a negligible role in providing music for the Church of England. Where do we look to find these isolated examples? Here are two of the most useful sources of information. On the left, Marshall's Book of Anthems, anthem texts published in 1840. Marshall was organist at Christ Church, Oxford. On the right, from Foster, who was a London organist, whose magnificent historical overview of the English anthem was published in 1901. The work of Jane Savage and Maria Barthellemon goes unnoticed, but they do refer to one clear example from around the same time. So this is a setting of Blessed are all they that fear the Lord. And if you look at the list of composers at the end of this psalm text, beginning with Purcell, the last name is Mosley. No further indication exists in the book as to who this is, but Foster, who took much information directly from Marshall, has this more helpful entry. Miss Lucy Mosley, Blessed are all they, Exeter 1793. The location Exeter is used here to indicate where the piece was performed or was known from. I know nothing more about this, and it's a challenge for someone to try and track down Lucy Mosley and perhaps this piece. Marshall starts his book with a list of all the composers with some brief biographical notes, where possible, but Lucy sadly doesn't appear in this list. However, two women do, both of noble birth. Lady Bagot was the youngest daughter of Frances Villiers, Lady of the Bedchamber and famous mistress of George IV. She married the Dean of Canterbury, who went on to become a bishop, and clearly her anthem, if we believe, was being performed by 1840. There is a surviving music list that shows it was performed at St George's Chapel, Windsor in 1857, and a Bagot in A Kyrie was still being performed at Canterbury Cathedral in 1880. The Reverend Bagot had become a Canon of Windsor from 1822 to 27, and then Dean of Canterbury 1827 to 1845. So it seems possible that his wife's anthem dates from his time at Windsor in the mid-1820s, and then the Kyrie after 1827. The anthem does in fact survive in the music manuscripts at Windsor, though I haven't yet seen it. Lady Charlotte Snyde was an extremely impressive individual, a pupil of William Crotch and a gifted painter and translator. it seems unlikely that the Bagot and Snide anthems were ever published. But when checking for Bagot in the Windsor catalogue, it was interesting to see two other women composers listed, also from the early or mid-19th century, though I haven't yet been able to track them down outside this context, shown here. The notable feature is the presence of service music, like Bagot's Kyrie in A, for communion. Further material waiting to be looked at by someone. The composer from whom we have the most church material from the middle of the 19th century, all unpublished, in her lifetime, appears to be Alice Mary Smith. Thanks to research by Ian Graham Jones, Christopher Ellis, and Leonard Sanderman, we now have editions of a series of unpublished liturgical choral works composed by her when in her 20s. Two of the anthems are known to have been performed in 1864 by Joseph Barnby at his highly rated choir at the Church of St Andrews, Wells Street. The anthems performed by Barnby are highlighted here in bold, though there's no evidence that the other works were ever performed. Here's the beginning of By the Waters of Babylon. All of her music has been recorded on the CD by Leonard Sanderman. Looking for published music, our trickle continues with works such as these. Anne Mounsey shows up again, unsurprisingly. But I'd like to highlight two others briefly. Clara Maccherone, another noble lady, and Oliveria Prescott, a professional musician, by whom we have both published and unpublished church works. Interesting are the proud claims being made here, found in Brown and Stratton's British Music Biography, concerning Clara Maccherone. Here she is. The title page of Maccherone's work mentions that it was performed at Canterbury Cathedral, being dedicated to Dr. William Longhurst, who was organist there at the time. Understandably, perhaps, the organ part looks more like a piano part, given Maccherone's excellence as a pianist. Here's the opening transcribed from the printed score. And here's the cover of Oliveria Prescott's anthem. As you can see, it proudly proclaims her association with the Royal Academy of Music, where Maccherone was a professor. Prescott's own teaching associated her with Cambridge, the all-female Newnham College, and her interest in harmony can be illustrated in this passage from the middle of the work. Although the piece is in C major, it drifts appropriately enough for the text far into flats, before this point where the opening tune returns with its sweeping rising seventh over the dominant pedal on the organ. As we move forward in our survey to the 20th century, you might describe what happens as being both good news and bad news. The good news is that in the wider world, more women composers gradually become recognised as major artists, though not without struggle, from Ethel Smythe onwards. But the bad news is that the contribution of women composers to the Church of England, remains but a trickle. We should not forget that the view held by many, not just Sidney Nicholson in the 1940s, that the all-male choir should remain inviolate as the ideal of a church choir in the Church of England, remained strongly prevalent, and that the involvement of women in the cultivation of church music at the highest level remained non-existent. To this might be added the observation that many of the greatest British women composers of the 20th century were not, in any case, interested in the church and its teaching. There's two examples one might cite, the secular Requiem by Phyllis Tate, or the Hymn to Man by Elizabeth Lutyens, with its Swinburne text ending, "Glory to man in the highest, for man is the master of things." At the turn of the 20th century, women were learning orchestral instruments more and more, and one such woman, Rebecca Clarke, whose viola sonata is justly famous, also tried her hand at choral writing. Here's the opening of her psalm setting, "He that dwelleth under the defence of the Most High," partly inspired by the music of Ernst Bloch. Clarke showed her score and that of another lost psalm setting to Gustav Holst, but it didn't go well. Clarke reports that Holst was very nice but criticised them severely. That was the end of her interest in sacred choral music. After the Second World War, new church pieces by the leading professional composers of the day, such as Britten and Tippett, were now being commissioned by enterprising priests and organists. Tippett's canticles for St John's, Cambridge in 1962, of course, dramatically blew away the notion of evensong as a kind of extension of the English traditional afternoon tea. Andrew Nestlinger, the current director of music of St John's, has observed as follows. The work was premiered in 1962, having been composed the previous year just after the completion of his second opera, King Priam. One hears Priam in the opening fanfare for the unique St John's Trompeta Real organ stop. Now, the a cappella equivalent of this piece emerged 3 years later with a setting of the canticles by Elizabeth Lutyens, another bold commission, this time by Coventry Cathedral. This was the year that Lutyens wrote her own favourite horror film score for The Skull. I didn't want you looking at this directly during the Magnificat, but if you like what you've heard, as I certainly do, then you may well wish to watch the film, where her bold modernist style is also put to good effect. A slightly earlier setting of the Evening Canticles by a woman is that composed by the indefatigable Ruth Gipps, whose contribution to the music scene around the middle of the century was immense. In 1955, she applied for the assistant role at BBC Midland Orchestra, only to be told that a woman could not command the respect of the orchestra. I'll spare you the actual reason given. For some years, Gipps was director of the City of Birmingham Choir, and when her son became a chorister at Westminster Abbey, she was moved to compose a setting of the Canticles, which she dedicated to the Abbey's choir and organist, William Mackay. Her compositions were notably conservative for the day, and her canticles might attract those who don't have quite the stomach or indeed the human resources for Lutyens. Here's the opening, enterprisingly programmed in 2019 by the City Chamber Choir. I'm now going to show you a few slides which give details of the notably small amount of church music composed by several of the leading women composers of the last century. There's no time to go into much detail, but it gives an idea of the continuing trickle of pieces, beginning with the three composers just considered, Clarke, Gipps and Lutyens. So as well as the one psalm by Clarke, there are just two short other pieces. Next, we have Lutyens, secular music, just the one Magnificat Nunc Dimittis that stands out. Next, we have Ruth Gipps, her Magnificat Nunc Dimittis, also an Easter carol written for the Abbey, and then some later liturgical music. Next, Imogen Holst, the three psalms, of course, with strings, so there's not much that is traditional church music. Her Mass in A minor is a sort of student piece in imitation of the Vaughan Williams Mass for double choir. Next, we have Elizabeth McConkie, nearly all secular, just two unpublished pieces, settings of John Donne, and some Christmas music. Grace Williams, large-scale orchestral works, is rather like Anne Ramsey. We have large-scale pieces, two psalms and Musica Cambrensis. The notable piece there, the Ave Maris Stella, commissioned by William Matthias, is a wonderful piece of music, not straightforward, but very worthwhile performing. And then next, Elizabeth Poston. Of course, the Christmas items are familiar. Also, one should mention her work as editor of the Cambridge Hymnal. And of her church pieces, one Festal Te Deum of 59, commissioned by St Matthew's Northampton, has just actually been discovered and republished, available as a digital download from Multitude of Voices. And then finally, Thea Musgrave, a few pieces from the middle of the last century, and then very recently commissioned by Wells Cathedral Choir, Missa Brevis and Anthem setting of College. So since Musgrave actually takes us up to the present day, I should perhaps conclude with some remarks about where we are now. It seems to me that two changes of practice in particular have fundamentally changed the landscape. One of my main points in this talk has been to emphasize the inevitability of the lack of music by women composers in a musical environment which hasn't just lacked female role models, but has simply historically had no place for serious involvement by girls or women at all, with the notable exception of the charity institutions of George in London. The two shifts I have in mind are the presence of women clergy from 1987 onwards, and then the gradual appearance of girls' choirs in cathedrals of various sorts. In the following slides, I've put these alongside some other significant dates. We have an interesting early example of a female lay clerk during the war, and David Woolston forming the Clerks of Oxenford in 1961. You can read the rest. We go on to the next slide. We have Oxbridge Colleges admitting women, and then highlighted in red these two particularly significant ones, I think. The first woman deacons ordained to the Church of England, and then, of course, later women priests, and the first UK cathedral girls' choir founded at Salisbury. You can read the rest, the last set here, ending with, most recently, the Society of Women Organists being founded, and the volumes of sacred music by women composers published by Multitude of Voices. In addition to these two fundamental shifts I mentioned, commissioning bodies naturally played a vital role in producing work by professional composers, and in terms of commissioning women composers, a number of organisations have played their part in recent years. One thinks perhaps of the Norwich Festival under Michael Nicholas, or the London Festival of Contemporary Church Music, St Pancras, led by Chris Batchelor. For me, one particular commission stands out: the choice of Judith Weir by the St Albans International Organ Festival in 1983, resulting in her anthem Ascending into Heaven. Here's the arresting opening. In the following year, she wrote Drop Down Ye Heavens for the choir of Trinity, Cambridge, and then in 85, Illuminare Jerusalem for King's. Weir had studied music at King's College, Cambridge, but was not well known before the St Albans Commission. The idea of commissioning the young Weir came from Novello. Stephen Darlington, who was then in charge of the festival, did not know her work and simply but courageously took up the publisher's recommendation. With Weir's Ascending into Heaven, at last had a brilliant anthem, widely admired in the profession, for a brilliant young woman composer who would go on to become the first woman master of the Queen's music, and available from a major publisher. Since the 1980s, the trickle of church music by women composers has become, well, if not yet a flood, then perhaps some sort of gently flowing stream in the decades through to now. However, here are a couple of statistical analyses to end with, underlining that an equal split is still far from being achieved. First, the London Festival of Contemporary Church Music. So 14% of commissions from women, but there's some very important birthday and showcase concerts of music by Diana Barrell, Cecilia McDowell and Judith Bingham. And secondly, the choir book for the Queen, which contains 7 by women composers, 2 of which were commissioned specially. Now, there are, of course, some advantages with growing old. You can get a COVID vaccine quickly, free prescriptions, and even transport in some places. And of course, one is almost expected to grumble endlessly about things not being as they used to be. I should confess that I recall feeling awkward in the presence of the first women clergy. And as a former Salisbury chorister myself, I recall a mild sense of threat when the girls' choir was established there. Though in truth, I was much more upset when Cathedral decided to change from purple to green cassocks in around 1970. However, the gradually increasing involvement of girls and women in Anglican church music at the highest level in this country during my lifetime has, of course, been heartening to observe, even if there's still much ground to be made up. The Society of Women Organists has only recently been founded, for example. And even if difficult questions still remain about issues such as the balance of work given to boy and girl choristers. But the changing environment within the Church of England in the last few decades should greatly assist in achieving a situation in the future where all composers, however they identify themselves, will wish to compose church music. Stephen Stratton was somewhat frustrated by some of the comments that his 1883 lecture received, and he challenged an opponent to return in 300 years to see whether women composers had finally achieved equal status and reputation. Well, we're almost halfway through the 300 years now, and even in the field of liturgical music for the Church of England, there are at least now some signs of progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Geoffrey, for a fascinating look at the history of women composers in the church. Hopefully, we are beginning to address that balance, and certainly from an RSCM point of view, the amount of music that we are publishing by women composers is much higher than it was when I joined nearly 20 years ago. So things I think are very much on the up, and actually probably our best-selling music now is written by women composers. So that's a great thing. So now before we go on to the questions, and if you've got any questions, now's the time to send them in using either the comment or the chat facilities on whatever you're whether you're using YouTube or Facebook. Firstly, I'm going to bring in Sarah King from our education team. Hello, Sarah.
Hi, Tim. Thank you, Geoffrey. Thank you, Tim. And thank you all very much indeed for joining us today. Well, we've reached the end of this series of lunchtime lectures, and I hope you've enjoyed watching them as much as we've enjoyed curating them. Of course, if you've missed any or want to revisit them, they are all still available on our YouTube channel. If you have enjoyed them, we would be really grateful if you would consider making a donation in response to support the work of the RSCM. We are a charity and receive no money from the church or the state, and your kind donations will help us to continue doing what we do, supporting church music and musicians, both in these COVID times and forwards into the future. They help make lecture series like these happen so that we can all continue learning through lockdown. They support our courses for young people and for adults so that we can develop and train church musicians for the years ahead. And your donations help us to develop new digital platforms so we can share resources and training more widely. And we rely on the kindness and generosity of people like yourselves to make all of this and more possible. So if you are able, please make a donation by texting the number on the screen or by clicking the gold donate button on our homepage, rscm.org.uk, or consider becoming an individual member of the RSCM. Today's discount code will be shared on screen shortly. Thank you for listening, and thank you for whatever you are able to contribute. Back now to Tim and Geoffrey for questions.
Thank you very much, Sarah. As Sarah said, if you can, do please show your appreciation for this lecture by texting or going online to make a donation. And if you want our membership offer, this week's code is now on the screen, S for sugar 7NJDB, and that'll expire at 5 p.m. next Thursday. Finally, as I said, this is the last in the series of lectures. but there may well be another series later on in the year. And as Sarah said, both the first series and second series are still available on our YouTube channel. In the meantime, on the 19th of March, we'll be hosting an organ recital at this time, so do make a note in your diary. So, Geoffrey, let's have a look at the questions, see what we've got. Okay. One from a regular contributor, John Woodhouse. What about the influence of the BBC in the proms? John would argue that Bernadette Farrell and Margaret Ritzer are better known than most of those mentioned in the church in general. Over to you.
Yeah, well, the history of women composers and their representation on the BBC is a fascinating one. And the role of William Glock, Ryan Trowell, others. I suppose what I'd say, though, that what my focus was on the music that was written specifically for the church. I'm sure that the BBC in the proms has played its part, as it did, of course, for Ethel Smythe in the early days, in promoting women's music generally. The problem in the church is that it doesn't map terribly easily onto that environment because of its very particular all-male status.
I'm just flicking through and seeing if I can find any other comments. Yeah. Come along, people, send in your questions. It's a little thing from Marion Smells, another regular to our things, just saying that that in Yorkshire apparently snide is pronounced sneed, but maybe it varies a bit like scone and scone, perhaps. Oh yes, there's a question about the piece that was sung by Ely, the girls at Ely. It was a very lovely piece, and just a question of whether it's available. I think it is available to buy, isn't it?
Yes, it was published by the Church Musical Society at the end of last year, and can be bought through the Oxford University Press website. So if you just search at Oxford for Jane Savage, it'll come up.
Okay, so there you go, Marion. I don't think it's on the RSCM website, I'm afraid, but maybe we'll put that right over the next, well, perhaps I'll do that as soon as the lecture's finished. I don't think we have any other questions, so I think it just remains for me to thank Geoffrey very much indeed for, as I say, it was a wonderful lecture, and to thank you all for watching. If you are able to donate or wish to become a member of the RSCM at a discount, the details will remain on the screen for a few minutes. And you may have seen in the video before the lecture began that we are starting a series of Come and Sing Compline services this coming Wednesday and for every Wednesday during Lent. So it's starting on the 24th of February. The idea is that the music that you respond to will be on the screen, so you can sing along as you go along. And for each service, there will be an anthem and an Nunc Dimittis available, and the music for that is available from our web shop at rscmshop.com. And we'll be getting up rehearsal tracks within the next couple of days. Apologise, there's been a slight delay in doing that, but we'll have that. And the organ recital with Piers Maxim is lunchtime on Friday the 19th of March. And finally, you may also want to take a note of our annual Music Sunday event, which is taking place on Sunday the 6th of June. If you'd like to be kept up to date with all our initiatives, then do please sign up to receive our newsletter, Notes from the Director, which you can do at the bottom of the homepage of our website rscm.org.uk. So thank you very much, Geoffrey. Thank you very much, everybody, for watching. And until the next series, goodbye.
Lead us